Good afternoon, everyone. It's a little after 1. This is February 3rd, and Senate Education is starting its afternoon of work. We're starting out today with Secretary French. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you with us, as usual. Secretary French is going to talk to us a little bit about the governor's proposal for the governor's child care proposal. Everyone likely heard that in the budget address, and he's going to take us through that. I've then asked him to talk a little bit about this church and state issues related to what we're seeing right now in our religious schools and vouchers. And I'm not articulating it as well as he will, but the short of it is what rules has the agency adopted, and we'll then hear from Professor Teachout, who'll talk a little bit more about some of those church and state issues that we've been reading about and learning about from our constituents. And then later in the afternoon, we will jump into our 3 bills that we have been spending the most time on, that being S16, some more on literacy, and the proposals from VSAC. I just met with the pro tem for a little while to go over some of our work and to also inform her, as I'll also inform all of you. We will on Tuesday be hearing from Jeff Fannin and his group of people, and I need to talk to you about this also, Mr. Secretary, about what they are envisioning for students that might have deficits in post-COVID Vermont. So that's just a little overview of where we're at. I now will turn it over to Mr. Secretary.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, Dan French, Secretary of Education. As the chair mentioned, I'll start off speaking a bit about our child care proposal, which is usually entitled Restructure of CDD. And I shared a PowerPoint. Jeannie, I don't know if you have that or not, but we can kind of use that. We prepared this PowerPoint for joint testimony between my, our folks at AOE and my esteemed colleagues at AHS who are not with me today. So I will do my best to cover that. And then I'll also,
French.
yes.
Secretary, I have made you co-host so you can share whatever documents you'd like. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And I'll make some comments about the sort of church and state issues, which is the subject of active litigation. Very interested in hearing Professor Teachout's observation on that. But I am essentially a named litigant in some of that work, so I'm going to be somewhat confine my comments to some general observations. But I did also share a document with the committee that describes some, I would say, guidance or recommendations of best practice that we put out to school districts. So I'll basically use that as the basis of my comments. So if that sounds good, I'll go ahead and share out my screen here on PowerPoint. Can you see that okay?
No, it's small.
Okay. I apologize. One moment. Getting bigger?
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. So, so our proposal at this point is really just a proposal. We haven't reduced this to specific statutory language. We acknowledge at the front that this is a very complex topic, and one of which will by necessity, invite a lot of stakeholder feedback and also feedback from legislators. So we intentionally put forward this with the idea that, here from an administrative side, here's something we're proposing from basically the theme of what would be, from our perspective, good government. But really willing and anxious to work with legislative partners and other stakeholders to bring this to some specificity. And I think, in fairness to this, the devil is in some of the details, so to speak. So there is some work to do in that regard. But I'll, as I mentioned, these are slides that we were jointly prepared for a presentation with my colleagues at AHS. I'm going to focus mostly on the Agency of Education side of that, but this will give you a sense of what's involved, I think. The Child Development Division inside the Agency of Human Services has several functions, one of which is child care and learning. So what we're proposing to do is to move the early care and learning aspects of the CDD division to the Agency of Education. Our policy in pre-K in particular, which is Act 166, has resulted in a sort of a bifurcation of administration. So the Agency of Education administers pre-K in the public school system, and the Agency of Human Services through the CDD division or through CDD oversees pre-K in the private providers, the care providers who take it on pre-K as well. And that has never been well received, particularly by the public school systems who find themselves regulated by two agencies, having to do 2 sets of fingerprints for staff, having to go through 2 basically inspections of those facilities and so forth. I would say since in my tenure as secretary, which is coming up on my 3rd year, this has been challenging to administer internally. There have been times when we have a regulation, if you will, that has led to disputes between the 2 agencies, and myself, Secretary Gobet or Secretary Smith have had to get together to try to figure out how to do this. So it's been challenging. Also in our data systems, you might have heard of this thing called the State Longitudinal Data System, or what we call the SLDS, which is a data warehouse project sponsored by the federal government. The Agency of Education is essentially the sponsor of that project. We built onto that to include early ed data, and it's been challenging to create a single data model in early ed, and I think the data is a key piece of the policy approach in this area. So at any rate, there's some things we've noticed inside of state government we think that could be improved by bringing the child care function under the same organizational roof, if you will, as pre-K, and to do that inside the Agency of Education. This does not mean the public school system taking over early learning and care. It basically brings these teams together under one organizational structure. I'll say, Child Development Division, the term division, I think varies somewhat among different agencies. The Agency of Education is obviously a much smaller organization, the Agency of Human Services. We're about 160 employees. Human Services is about 3,500, something like that. And our divisional structure inside the agency, we don't have departments, we just have divisions. Our divisions are about 20 to 30 people. So this change would basically necessitate us creating a new division at the Agency of Education, which for discussion purposes, I'll label a division of early learning and care. So we would have approximately 30 to 35 people in a new division under new leadership, which I think is key to sort of bring this together as a single team of integrated service from birth to 5-year-olds to kindergarten, essentially, which I think is rather intriguing from our standpoint. There are, yeah, go ahead.
So those 30 to 35 people, they are already, where are they now? Are those, we're not talking, just for clarification, we're not talking new staff. This is
That's correct. These are largely bringing over approximately 29 CDD staff to the Agency of Education.
Thank you.
So there's nothing happening in terms of like the Agency of Education having to learn how to do this space. We're bringing over that expertise from another agency. The idea here is to, just making the point, that this would necessitate the creation of a new division, not so much integrating these employees from CDD into an existing agency education, because our pre-K team is pretty small right now, and it's embedded inside of what we call the Student Supports Division, which also includes special education and a few other critical functions. So for us, it's a great way to put emphasis on this critical policy area by now having enough staff and focus to necessitate the formation of a division. And the division leaders inside the Agency of Education are essentially members of my immediate leadership cabinet. So it elevates this function also to a very high level inside in a prioritization inside the Agency of Education. The point I'd make also from this slide is there are elements of CDD that do not come over to the Agency of Education on this proposal. So this is the piece that the Agency of Human Services, if we were doing this as joint testimony, would speak more directly to. But there's, on this slide, for example, the financial assistance program would be as a benefit program housed at the Department of Children and Families. So there's some pieces of CDD. Basically, CDD would be dissolved and parts of it would be broken up into different places inside the Agency of Human Services. But this core function of childcare would be brought over to the Agency of Education. The theory of action here is to have an integrated approach and a more integrated approach. Sort of, as you've heard, the governor's vision, cradle to career. But we also know of all the research we have out there in the education space, there's pretty compelling evidence to suggest that the best investment we can make in the education area is on pre-K, and particularly early learning and care. If we look at very successful education systems in the world, like Finland, their education system is built on a foundation of really birth to 5, making all the investment they make in prenatal care and so forth. So that's part of seen as an integrated investment of social services, of which education is sort of the receiving end of it, if you will. But we think there's, if we get very intentional about this, and not to harp on the Finnish experience, I had the pleasure of going on an education tour of Finland several years ago. But Finland's history is kind of interesting. They basically started to exist as a nation state after World War II for the very first time in their history. And their story, when they talk about their education system, is, basically at that moment in time, they looked around and said, we don't have a lot of natural resources. We have forests. Our biggest resource are our people. We need to invest very strategically in building the best education system in the world. And that's basically what they did very intentionally through like 20 to 30 year period. I would argue Vermont's in a similar place. Arguably, we have wonderful natural resources, but in the era of declining, our demographic challenges that we face, we cannot afford to have any student not get off to a good start. Any individual, any Vermonter not get off to a good start. We need every Vermonter to be able to be successful. So I feel that sort of prioritization that maybe Finland felt as well. So that's sort of the theory of action, to do that administratively in state government. There are, once again, from an administrative standpoint, some, I won't say efficiencies, but also some improvements that are going to be gained. I talked about the sort of bifurcation of the administration of Act 166, the pre-K. This would now be brought under one roof. We'd be able to eliminate some of that dual regulatory oversight that's been problematic. We have federal funding streams. That idea is the Individual Disabilities Education Act, basically special ed law. There's some revenues that come down through that program, Part B, Part C. They're arguably focused on the same issue, to help kids get off to a good start. But currently, AHS administers Part B, AOE administers Part C. And the handoff between those two things isn't as smooth as it could be if it was administered by one agency. This piece on the integrated benefits is the efficiency to be gained at the DCF side, on the AHS side, by basically now looking at a composite level, the benefits that are administered to families. Currently, CDD administers a separate benefit program that families might be receiving later on through another benefit program in DCF. So this gives DCF view into a more seamless look at benefits. I mentioned the data system piece. Some of these components are more AHS oriented, so if you want to dig more deeply into those, I'd recommend bringing AHS in. But the theory is that there's some things to be gained administratively. This is disruptive, certainly, but by putting pieces together and under one administrative and leadership team, there's some advantages. I will also say, by introduction, I don't have firm data on how these services are staffed nationally, but it's not uncommon to see them housed as they are now among two different agencies, but it's also equally common to see them brought together under one agency. So it's kind of, I wouldn't say 50-50, but there's a bit of both going on nationally. And I mentioned, I can get into the specifics of how the services break down, but generally speaking, childcare would be coming over to the Agency of Education. There's mental health components of CDD that would go to the Department of Mental Health. Aspects, as I mentioned, benefit administration and so forth, that would go to the DCF. I'm going to skip through some of the AHS aspects, but they would make a compelling argument for why early childhood mental health should be integrated into the broader understanding of mental health. not be separate in a separate division inside the Agency of Human Services. Similarly, DCF would make an argument as to why benefit administration would be better done under one organizational entity in AHS as opposed to having multiple entities doing that. And I guess I'll just end on this slide. But, you know, again, what we're proposing is not to move all of CDD to AOE, but a good part of it, particularly that function around childcare licensing, referral, Head Start, gets into the pre-K administration, which is 166, or early learning and care, and so forth, as I mentioned. So, you know, this more or less concludes sort of my overview of what we're proposing. Once again, the devil's in the details on this. We intentionally knew going into the legislative process that there's a lot of stakeholders that need to be involved in this, state employees, legislators. So we're proposing to work with legislative leaders to bring this down to a level of specificity, because it is something I think that's fairly complex. We're also not expecting to do this in 1 year. So we would like to set the train in motion, if you will, and then work on the structural budgetary pieces as a follow-on piece of work. When I say budgetary pieces, meaning the state government budget structure. So why don't I end there, and I'll take some questions, and then we can transition over to
Great.
religion and schools.
Thank you. Committee questions. Your first one.
Yeah, thanks, Secretary French. And I guess the one question I have is, did you look at it from both sides of saying, like, I think it makes sense to definitely combine it under one roof and one administrative structure. Did the administration look at doing the reverse of taking the stuff that education is doing and putting in DCF, as well as taking the DCF stuff and putting in ed? And why did you decide the one way you decided?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think I will say this is not a new topic. It's been on the table since I started as secretary, at least. I think my predecessor, Rebecca Holcomb, and Secretary Gobay, the year, I think probably 2017, somewhere in that time frame, 2016, 2017, had conducted a statewide tour, sort of a listening town hall, if you will, about how to address issues around 166. How is 166 being implemented? How's it going? And certainly, as I mentioned, the public schools have been almost uniformly critical of the dual agency oversight. But the result of that sort of visitation around the state was that this is just sort of my editorial comment, that the secretaries basically concluded that it's hard to get agreement on this area, so therefore we should divorce. And that's what I used to call it, the divorce bill. You know, so there was a bill introduced in 2018 or 2019, Senator Bruce brought forward to divorce this and to break it apart. And that was sort of my initiation into this policy space as secretary, because I was certainly focused on Act 46 at that moment. But I observed that it is problematic to have multiple agencies involved implementing a single program. So I thought the divorce was a useful construct. I was very interested at that time looking at fixing 166 and then figuring out how to staff it inside of state government second. I've subsequently come around to think it's hard to get better policy if we don't have coherence inside of state government. So we've been working on this for a bit. I guess my long-winded response. I think there's been a natural impetus to kind of think about pulling things from AHS and putting them into other agencies, just because AHS is so large. This is just my editorial observation as someone who doesn't work inside of AHS. But also the Agency of Education has started to take on some of the technical sort of back office functions in this area. So we own the data warehouse. We run the bulk of special education. So there are some programmatic pieces that sort of put the momentum on our side as well. And the fact that we're smaller and many of the functions that are in pre-K make sense if they're attached to the rest of the education process.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you. And we also are looking at this in Senate Health and Welfare. At least we've taken a quick look at it. I guess the question that I have is, did you consider at all having a universal pre-K and then building special ed and moving some of the special ed issues into education rather than parent-child centers, home visiting, and some of the, we've done a lot of work over the past few years in integrating these systems, including CIS. And now it feels like all that work is being pulled apart. So did you consider looking at universal pre-K and then the special ed integration that I think has always been an issue?
Yeah, I think, the topic, I appreciate the question. Universal pre-K for me sort of falls into that conversation about what is the policy. And my initial disposition towards this was to let's talk about the policy and then figure out how to structure the state government response as a secondary approach. As I mentioned, I sort of come around to that as we've had difficulty articulating reform to 166. In particular, is that we're working across agency boundaries, and there's just a lot of effort and energy focused on just convening that conversation in state government on how to create better policy. So I think, the thinking here is to create a structure that is set up by definition to be integrated, and to have also organizational capacity and all the resources focused on the policy, and then to advance policy as a secondary outcome of that. But right now, inside the Agency of Education, we have a team of 5 people essentially that works on pre-K. We have a director of pre-K, but we don't have adequate policy staff to really get into advancing a larger policy on pre-K. Essentially, our staff are solely focused on administering Act 166 as it is. So once again, creating a division inside the agency and a division director that's going to be focused on early learning and care with a robust staff of approximately 35 people gives this policy area some horsepower, so to speak, that will allow us to engage more proactively on policy development.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to pivot to talk about special education, but I'll stop.
No,
there.
go ahead, please do.
Yeah, I don't see this necessarily as taking things apart. I know there's been a lot of good work that's gone on. I will say, I think the bulk of special ed obviously happens, I think, in the Agency of Education. I mean, that's, we take over pretty clearly after grade 3 or age 3, and then certainly up to age 22. So the bulk of it is inside the Agency of Education. So it makes sense to me sort of naturally that we would put it all under one roof as to having a slice of it someplace else. But I understand there's a lot of integration that's already occurred. My intention would be to, this organizational structure would be a catalyst for further integration, not something that would be disruptive of the work that's already occurred.
Well, that will remain to be seen. So we'll have to, there are a lot of details there and a lot of questions to be asked, obviously. When I see different programs being moved to the Department of Health or to somewhere else and not fully integrated, it is a concern. It's not a concern so much from the administrative side, because that, what you're suggesting poses administrative efficiencies, but it does suggest that there may be some confusion on the part of families and children and what the model looks like for the kids who are 0 to 3 and maybe even 0 to 5. So just,
yeah, I think there would be a disruption. Obviously, this is a significant change.
no, and I don't mean just in the change process. I mean, once it's accomplished, we see so much disservice to people sometimes when we try to make administrative efficiencies. And as you were talking about Finland, for example, the amount of resources that are put into the work that Finland does on after school or early childcare is significant. So it seems to me that one consideration might be simply to increase the resources available to your agency to cover the needs that are currently there. I'm getting a feeling that we're going to start spreading ourselves even thinner than we are.
Yeah,
That's just my initial response.
Yeah, no, I think these are great conversation. I would just make the general observation again that there's, from a national perspective, there's no right way to do this, so there's no one way that everyone's realized is the best way. And all states are administering Idea B, Idea C, special education, and so forth. Virtually all states have some commitment to pre-K. So there's no one right model. I think what we're talking about is what's the best potential model for us as a state. And I think we do have to be cognizant of the resources we do have based on the scale at which we operate, which is, from the public education system, 75,000 students. So we have to keep that in mind. I think it's a conversation that we should have a focused conversation about. I agree that Finland's also, from a financial point, put the prioritization on making the investments, but they also have straightened out a lot of their infrastructure. It's essentially a seamless integration from their perspective on doing that. So the two go hand in hand from my perspective. It's not just a question of putting resources. And I couldn't honestly guarantee to you, if you were to give me additional resources in this regard, I couldn't guarantee you that we'd have the policy outcomes that you desired, because there's a lot of internal, I would say, tension between the apparatus and how these services get delivered. So I think it's got a lot of potential if we try to put these together under one roof.
Senator Lyons, did you have a follow-up?
No, I'm
Okay.
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Hooker.
Thank you. And thank you, Secretary French. When you talk about 75,000 students, that includes what ages? From 0?
That's K through 12 students in our public education system.
How many children are we servicing from 0 to 3?
Yeah, I don't have a solid handle on those numbers because it's not an area I have direct oversight over.
AHS would have that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I guess my only question right now is, it doesn't sound like there's anything for us to do. It sounds like this was, again, a good overview of what the administration is thinking about, and you'll continue just to be in touch with us as you move forward, and if there are certain policy decisions that you'll need us to consider along the way. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to come and give an overview. To date, this presentation has been provided, I think, to a joint meeting of the House Human Services Committee and the House Education Committee. We haven't had a chance to that was last week. I don't think we've had a chance to recoup inside of state government, but we'll be reaching out and if there's interest in pursuing this with folks.
Great, thank you so much. And the other thing, just so you know, knowing how busy your schedule is, I can't imagine you are checking our agenda every day, but Allie Richards is coming in tomorrow, and she is going to give Let's Go Kids their overview of what direction they're heading in, what they would like to do, and I also asked her to weigh in on this. So.
Yeah, we've had a great conversation on it. I mean, to their credit, they've put together a very solid plan, which I appreciate. It's just to make the observation. It's been an interesting policy space for me. This is an area where there's broad agreement that pre-K investment should be made in early learning and care across the political spectrum, across different advocacy groups. Yeah. On the other hand, it's exceedingly challenging to get consensus on how to do it. So everyone's heart's in the right spot, but the mechanics of it are tricky.
Thank you. Well, now on to an easier topic. So I'm wondering if you would, as we start to look at this issue, just bring us back, if you're comfortable doing so, where things are, how things got started, and the agency overall, what you're doing to respond.
Yeah, it's a great way to frame it. And I have about 15 more minutes left, so I'm going to, just let you know. There's been, and I'm intimidated somewhat by Professor Teachout being here, who I only know through reputation. But I'll just make my sort of layman's observations, and also as secretary, I'm not an attorney.
Sure.
But there's been a national effort to look at these issues, and in particular, the Trinity Lutheran decision of the U.S. Supreme Court a few years ago in Missouri. And there's been more or less a sort of a change in how the Supreme Court's looking at these issues. And there was sort of a national effort to look at state constitutions and the provisions of state constitutions, and how they might apply to these questions of separation of church and state. Vermont is a state that has such provisions in what we call the compelled support clause. So there's been active litigation around the country as part of sort of this national change in disposition towards these issues. We've been, I want to say, caught up in that. I'm a named litigant in 2 cases right now. One's on dual enrollment. If you're familiar with our dual enrollment program, we basically provide 2 courses for free for students, and we have not allowed students who attend, let's say, religious high schools to participate in that. So there was a case brought forth on that issue. The other case has to do with tuitioning, and this is the one I'll speak more directly to. I did send to your committee sort of a description of a guidance document. I won't put it on the screen, but you have that sort of for your background reading. The tuitioning system in Vermont is based on, once again, the state's ultimately responsible for the education of students per our Constitution, and that's been sort of agreed on through the Brigham decision, and most recently, I think, with Act 46 and the litigation around that. The state delegates authority to local school districts on how to educate students, and districts basically have 2 modes or means by which they can do that. One is they either operate schools, or 2, they provide tuition for students to be educated in some other school. And those other schools have to have some approval status through the state. They have to be approved to receive public tuition dollars. So we get into the status argument, how are these schools approved or not? We've had some litigation in Vermont, starting with the Manchester decision, and then more recently in the Chittenden decision, which I still think is 1999, but still fairly recent. And around this issue of to what extent religious schools can receive tuition. And, this is where I'm going to get sort of hesitant in what I say, but I think basically folks would agree that the Vermont Supreme Court has decided that religious schools can receive public tuition dollars, provided there are adequate safeguards to ensure that the funds that are being used for tuition are not also involved with religious activities that the religious school might be directly engaged in. So that's sort of the rub of it. It's not about, in Vermont, it's not about whether religious schools can receive tuition, yes or no, because essentially that's been decided. Yes, they may, but with school districts who make those decisions have to ensure the funds are being used appropriately. And that's where we get into the document that I shared with you that we recently published to provide, we can't basically from a state perspective or the agency's perspective decide whether religious schools should receive tuition or not. That's been decided by the Vermont Supreme Court. The answer is yes. The question is, how do school districts go about ensuring there are safeguards on how those dollars get used? So we provide some recommendations on how they might do that. But this is a topic of active consideration by the courts literally this week. So it's a dynamic situation, to say the least.
Thank you. Questions for Secretary French before we hear from Professor Teachout? Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for coming in. Feel free. I know you might have a few moments. We are actually, before I turn it over to Professor Teachout, I wonder if we might just take a quick 2-minute break. I just need to check in down the hall, and I apologize for that. And we'll just take an early stretch, if you don't mind, Professor, just for 2 minutes, and then we'll be right back. Thank you.
Take your time. Okay. I'll see if I can pull up a document.
Professor Teachout, as I was saying before we started, it's an honor to meet you. And I remember following your daughter's few campaigns. So I didn't know that you were actually related, but when I saw the last name, it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I saw your great, 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 great grandfather's name too, so it's nice to meet you.
Hard to escape my roots, I like to say.
Yeah, good, good. My great, great, great grandfather, according to a guy named Brest Orton, uh,
I think the host has muted us. I think they muted you as well. I can't hear you, sir, but I'm thinking Jeannie.
there. Okay, I'm having, Mr. Chair, I'm having a little difficulty figuring out how to share a document on the screen. I wonder if Jeannie could help me locate it so I can share it.
Sure.
It would be on your computer. If you can't share it from your computer, let me know.
Okay, let me see what I can find. How do I find it on my computer?
Professor Chicho, is it something that you emailed to us?
Yeah.
Okay, if you'd prefer, we're happy to pull it up on our iPads. We
Okay,
have.
why don't we try that? In the meantime, let me just give it one more shot.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Yeah. Mhm. No. No, that's not it. So how do I do that? So I want to get this there. No.
So is that what you were hoping for?
I'm trying to, I think I've got it coming, Mr. Chair. Here we, no, that's just the appendix, unfortunately. So shall we go without it, which the problem is now I have to find my own testimony. I'll be right with you. I
Okay.
apologize.
And senators, please know if you haven't found it, it is on our webpage under today's date, and then go to Professor Chicho's name.
That's not it. Okay.
I can share it from here if you want.
Jeannie, if somebody could share it from there, that would be great, because I am having difficulty finding it on my own laptop.
Jeannie, if you don't mind doing that, that would be a big help.
There we go. Is that visible now?
It is. I'm just going to ask Jeannie to enlarge it. Enlarge it, please.
And Jeannie, when I ask, maybe we'll scroll down a little bit so I can refer to specific points I make. My name is Peter Teachout.
I'm just going to hold on one second, Professor. Jeannie, is it possible to make it larger?
It's full on my screen. I don't know how else to
So
do it.
senators should just follow along on their iPads. Before you start, I just want to pause for just a moment and just recognize that this is a sensitive topic in the United States, in this state, sometimes even with one another. And so what I appreciate, and I know we all do, is just a respectful, thoughtful dialogue around this topic that, again, can be sensitive. So with that, Professor, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Peter Teachout. I'm a professor of constitutional law and First Amendment law at Vermont Law School. And my areas of interest are United States and Vermont constitutional law and history. I've published a number of articles in those fields, although not in this specific field. And I've testified before other committees and Senate Education Committee on previous occasions on other issues involving constitutional dimensions of legislation being considered by various committees up there. I hope in my testimony today, which I'm going to try to keep as brief as possible, I can be helpful. I'm going to share with you just a few ideas. I want to apologize in advance for my written testimony. It's a rush job, but I thought it'd be more helpful to have something in writing than nothing at all in writing to refer to. So I'm going to share with you my own suggestions, my views, but I'm very much open to question and criticism and pushback because this is an area that is a potential landmine in terms of constitutional issues. My whole effort, by the way, I was born and raised in Vermont, went to the Union School in Montpelier and Montpelier High School, and very much bring to, I guess, the teaching and thinking about constitutional law what I would call a Vermont sensibility. So my instinct here, just to give you a little perspective, is to see is there some way to bring Vermont's tuition reimbursement policy, which Secretary of French just described, into compliance with the US Supreme Court's decision in the Espinoza case without violating the compelled support clause in Article 3 of Chapter 1 of the Vermont Constitution. I have, in preparation and in other earlier discussions, I've read District Court Judge Rice's decision that was handed down on January 7th in AH versus French. I read the emergency injunction that was issued by Circuit Judge Menashe in that same case just a couple weeks ago on January 22nd. I am familiar with the best practices memorandum that Secretary French referred to that was issued by the Agency of Education on January 15th. And I have to say I'm impressed by that document and generally agree with the approach recommended there, with a couple of concerns about practical implementation with respect to the recommendations. So consistent with that background, and just as a sensible stopgap measure, this is my suggestion. I suggest that school districts that are subject to the emergency injunction that was issued by the Circuit Court adopt and announce the following policy. Here it is. It's the policy of this school district to authorize payment of monthly requests for reimbursement of tuition from all independent schools, regardless of religious status or affiliation, upon receipt of certification that none of the tuition for which reimbursement is requested has been or will be used to support religious instruction, worship, other religious activity, or the propagation of religious views. Now, Jeannie, could you scroll down just a little bit at this point? Okay, there we go. Okay. I want to stress that if this policy were to be adopted by school districts, it should apply to requests for tuition reimbursement from all participating independent schools and not just those that somehow have religious affiliations. It's really important that it be applied neutrally and equally and uniformly across the board. So this is a pretty simple, as I would call it, Vermont solution, but I think it does the work, at least as a stopgap measure. So why does it do so? It's in compliance with Judge Rice's decision in the AH versus French case and with Judge Menashe's emergency injunction, since there would no longer be discrimination, quote, based solely on religious status. It would be consistent with the US Supreme Court's ruling in the Espinoza case for the same reason. Chief Justice Roberts, throughout the majority opinion in that case, says the problem in this case that we are dealing with is discrimination against religious institutions or religious persons based simply or solely on religious status. We do not decide whether or not there can be some restrictions on the religious use of government aid or money. We're just not deciding that. So this proposal also is consistent with the court's approval in earlier cases of the use by government of what I call the certification mechanism. Notice it's pretty simple. You're entitled to tuition upon certification that none of the tuition that you're requesting has been or will be used for religious purposes. And I'm going to elaborate on that in just a moment. But this is an approach that has been approved by the courts in earlier cases. There's an Agostini case involving special education in religious schools, and Mitchell versus Helms, which involved providing educational materials and equipment to both non-religious and religious schools. As those cases demonstrate, it's a simple and practical and workable approach. And then next paragraph, most importantly for school districts in Vermont, it's consistent with the compelled support clause in Article 3 of Chapter 1 of the Vermont Constitution and the Vermont Supreme Court's decision in the Chittenden case. It provides, the court has said, a constitutionally sufficient safeguard to ensure that Vermont taxpayer dollars will not be used to support religious instruction or worship or the propagation of religious views with which taxpayers may fundamentally disagree. So in the appendix to my written testimony, I have laid out the basic history, background, original understanding of Article 3 in the Vermont Constitution, and in particular, the original understanding of the compelled support clause. And I think if you're interested in history, you will find it very interesting. It's also relevant, I think, to what we're dealing with here. What I'd like
we lost you there, Professor. It looks like we've lost him altogether. Let's just give him a minute to make his way back. Oh, there you are.
there, I'm sorry, I think
Okay.
I got cut off momentarily. I don't know where I got cut off, but it's not terribly important. I think you can get a sense of where I'm going. I suggested sort of a very simple approach to dealing with this problem, at least in the short term. I just wanted to say a word that the United States Supreme Court, in earlier cases, has approved this certification mechanism as a way of providing safeguards against government funds and government aid being used to support religious instruction and worship. And I quote from that opinion in my written testimony from a concurring opinion written by Justice O'Connor, concurred in by Justice Breyer, which was essential to the court's decision to uphold a particular program providing educational materials and instructional equipment to both private secular and private religious schools. And in that quotation, Justice O'Connor writes, the safeguards employed by the program are, quote, constitutionally sufficient. And what they did is both the federal government required that the aid provided not be used for religious worship or purposes or instruction, and the states required signed assurance that the government aid would not be used for religious purposes or instruction. I think they put it the other way around, would only be used for secular uses and purposes, but with the same thrust. So that mechanism is available. It has been approved in other cases. It kind of does the work and does it in a very simple and straightforward and practical way. I want to make just one other general point, other than providing you with that historical material about Article 3, where it came from, the original understanding of what it meant. And that is to say that one of the key differences between the Montana constitutional provision, which was challenged in the Espinoza case, and the compelled support clause in the Vermont Constitution, is the Montana provision was based on, replicated what was called a Blaine Amendment. Blaine Amendment never adopted at the federal level, but lots of states adopted sort of mini Blaine amendments. And the problem with those provisions, the court said, is they were intended quite specifically to discriminate against Catholics. The Vermont compelled support clause had no such purpose, was adopted at a very different point in time. Its purpose was really to protect what back then the Council of Censors called the right of conscience. That is the right that each of us have to be sure that our taxpayer monies will not be used to support the propagation of religious views with which we fundamentally disagree. Now, I think the committee may have seen a very helpful PowerPoint developed by Jim Damaris for the Legislative Council. That gets into the weeds a lot more than I do here, but I just wanted to share with the committee, hey, look, it's really important right at this point in time for the local school districts that are affected to make clear that their policy now is not to discriminate based with respect to tuition reimbursement, with respect to the religious status of the school that's requesting reimbursement, but still at the same time ensure that in doing so, you don't violate the compelled support clause of the Vermont Constitution by providing taxpayer support for the purpose of religious instruction and worship. So that's the basic thrust of my testimony at this point. There are lots of complications, but that is the basic thrust of what I would like to.
If I may, I just want to, before we start questions, I just want to back up just so everyone knows where we're at. This, again, we're talking about tuitioning districts. Is that accurate? Districts that are tuitioning, that have the ability to tuition out.
I
Can I respond to that?
Please, yes.
Yeah, so for the record, Jim Damaris, Council, that is true that this would apply to tuition districts. However, operating districts on a one-off basis can approve a student to be tuitioned out of the operating district to another school. So it also could apply there as well.
It would apply where, Jim?
So if for tuition districts for sure, a school that operates, for example, a high school, if the parent of the high school student says, hey, the school doesn't offer programs that I want my child to have,
Okay.
it's offered over there at this other school, then the school district can tuition out that one student to the other school. So
Okay.
it can apply to operating districts as well as to tuition districts, but in the main, it's around tuition districts.
So related, so that's helpful. I'm wondering if you would start by helping us, how would you define religious purposes? In other words, if you think about how one teaches science, what they teach, what an afternoon after school program might involve, teach, and support, how would you define that?
Well, that is a problem, and I want to recognize it is a problem. Under my approach, you would leave it up to the school, the independent school, in this case, either a religious school or not a school, to simply say, we're not using this money for, we could change that language from religious purpose, for purposes of religious instruction or worship, or for the propagation of religious views. So you could get rid of the word purpose, except saying for purposes of. And then under the certification process, it's not great, but it's very simple. You would leave it to the independent school to certify. We're not using your tuition money for purposes of religious instruction, worship, or the propagation of religious views. That requires a certain amount of trust that,
Sure.
that schools will be operating in good faith. But all I can say is in Mitchell versus Helms, the court found that that was a sufficient safeguard against abuse. Now, if abuse comes to the attention of the public or the authorities or the school district, I think maybe we ought to build in somewhere into the system some grounds for saying you are going to lose your status as an approved school. But that's sort of secondary to the basic approach. Let me, if I could just allow.
Sorry to interrupt, but I do know others have questions, and I just want to sort of get some of those out there. Senator Chittenden, you had your hand up? You do not. Senator Hooker.
I think this is pretty basic and maybe it doesn't even apply, but are those schools that are receiving funds required to have separate accounts for that money so that it can be assured that the money's not being used for religious purposes?
That's a really good question. The answer is right now, no, because they have been automatically denied until now their ability to apply for tuition reimbursement simply because of their religious status. So we're moving into another world. Now, the best practices document that was promulgated by the Agency of Education suggests there might be three sort of categories of schools that would be applying for tuition. There are schools that would say, we don't use tuition money for religious instruction or worship at all. Or two, to the extent we have components of religious instruction and worship at our school, those programs are completely separate from the basic secular program. I don't know if that's true for any school, but that at least would be a second category. The problematic category is the third one, where you say, well, okay, and this is your question, Senator Hooker. How do you, as a sort of an accounting matter, separate out those components that involve religious instruction or worship, especially at a school that promotes itself as, how can I put it, being pervasively religious? throughout the entire program. That is our entire, and in some ways that's the attraction of the school, because sort of the entire program involves help me out with the right word here.
Well, just a whole sort of soup to nuts experience around with regard to religion. There are some schools that might do that, and that is like their selling point, if you will.
So, and I think that's the idea is maybe the Agency of Education could sort of set up an accounting system. Well, you can't include teachers that you would want to cover under a ministerial exception. That is, that's a special category. Or you might want to exclude from eligibility certain particular courses in the program. But it just seems to me you get into incredible levels of complexity. I would hate to sort of draw up a laundry list of those courses that qualify, those aspects of the program that qualify, or those that don't. That's why it's so much simpler simply to say, hey, look, we aren't maybe requesting the full load of tuition reimbursement, but we do guarantee you that the tuition reimbursement we're requesting has not been and will not be used for purposes of religious instruction or worship. But it's an incredible problem if you try to developing an elaborate accounting system for figuring out what qualifies or doesn't qualify. Jim Damaris and I have talked about that. So I invite you, if you'd rather approach it that way, but I was trying to make it as simple as possible.
Sure. Other questions? Senator Lyons.
I guess it's more of a comment, but it is also a question that regardless of what we do and regardless of what policy a school might be putting in place and then attesting to, it could still be tested in the courts. So it's getting our feet wet and then hoping for the best.
Well, even that's putting it optimistically. Look, I said what's really important, because of the court injunction that is hanging over those school districts' heads right now, that the school districts make it clear that we're no longer going to deny you tuition reimbursement solely because of the religious status. We're going to give you a chance to apply. Okay. That is, as I think we can say, just kicking the can down the road. And why I think even that's optimistic is because running through Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in the Espinoza case, he constantly says we don't have to decide today whether a more carefully tailored restriction on the use of government funds might or might not survive constitutional challenge. We don't have to decide that today because the Montana prohibition basically prohibits access to this government aid solely based on the religious status. So we can say, hey, let's avoid that. The court doesn't say anything, however, definitively. What if the prohibition really is simply, we can't provide you with tuition funds if those tuition funds are going to support religious instruction or worship? Now, we have to deal in Vermont with the fact the Vermont Constitution prohibits the use of government funds for purposes of religious instruction and worship. That's the Chittenden decision by the court back in the late 90s. So it's sort of like we're trying to sail between the Scylla of violating the federal constitution and the Charybdis of violating the Vermont Constitution. And the way to do that, at least as a stopgap measure, is to simply say, hey, look, you're eligible. You just certified that you're not going to use those funds for purposes of religious instruction and worship, and we'll provide those funds on the same terms we do to any independent school. Constitutionally okay, practically simple, but it's going to be challenged.
Senator Chittenden.
So I'm concerned that my question might be entirely germane to this discussion, but it's in the ballpark, and it has to do with something we've taken testimony on, which is the notion of these tuitions for university programs and direct versus indirect support. I don't know if that's falling squarely here, but I think Chair Campion made a point that if a religious school is going to offset its curriculum and not offer, say, advanced math, thus benefiting by not having to stand that program up, and then use the program that the state offers to allow those students to attend the University of Vermont using state dollars through that tuition thing. Is that not part of this broader discussion about religiousness? And if it is, I'd love to know what constitutes direct support and what is indirect support that we might need to be aware of or condition on certification process.
Well, Senator Chittenden, I probably am not familiar enough with exactly what you're talking about. It seems to me it would be germane if, in fact, the state of Vermont is providing state aid to colleges in Vermont to offer courses that involve not introduction to religion, but religious instruction and involve religious worship. That the same problem would happen. Now, under the dual enrollment program, my understanding of the way that program works is that we reimburse colleges, including religious colleges, for providing dual enrollment education to Vermont students. But as I understand, we're not providing that money directly to, say, Rice, or if it Mount St. Joseph or something like. We're not providing that aid directly to the religious high school that the student is attending. We're providing rather the reimbursement to the university. So that if that means indirect rather than direct, then that seems to me to be okay.
Professor Teachout, you and I had this, I wouldn't say disagreement, but conversation briefly a few years ago, where when this dual enrollment topic came up, and the point being was, if a religious institution decides to, as Senator Chittenden said, say, we are going to fire the history teacher, and all of your history classes are now at CCV, that therefore frees up dollars that indirectly could pay off a sexual abuse lawsuit. It could, these dollars could now be free to, support the minister, all those kinds of things. And I think what you said to me at the time was it needs to happen in order for that kind of to be figured out, if you will.
So I remember that conversation, Senator Campion. The explanation is there are two kinds of diversion that we worry about. One is where an institution uses government aid to directly support religious instruction, worship, something like that. We worry that those funds will be used, and that is prohibited by the Vermont Constitution. There's another kind of divertibility that I think we were talking about, which is that if we free up, for example, the resources that Rice has to teach courses like history or math or science, by funding those courses, that will free up resources to teach the religion courses. And all I can say is the court has addressed that second kind of divertibility, where the actual money is going to secular subjects, but that frees up the resources of the religious institution to devote them to religious instruction. The Supreme Court has pretty much ruled that out as a basis for objection. I don't know if that makes good sense. I don't know if I agree with it, but I can tell you that the Supreme Court has basically said we don't worry about that kind of divertibility from a constitutional standpoint. I believe that was our conversation. January.
Yeah, absolutely right. That was our conversation.
January of, when was it? 1918. Testimony on dual enrollment.
Our conversation was more recent than that.
It could be. It could be. Okay.
Professor,
So,
I'm wondering, what are the chances of, 5 years from now, we are having lawsuits around my child was not taught what might be settled science in the United States as it relates to evolution. My child was subjected to anti-LGBTQ posters in schools, into schools that were funding with public dollars. My child, there's a club or activity that is most people would consider to be religious, and my tax dollars are supporting that, and I have concerns. I mean, it sounds to me that we no longer have what I grew up with in a way, having had a grandfather that was a judge, and talking about this, there was a kind of a dark line there with separation of church and state. It seems like this gray area is it could cause additional court cases.
Absolutely. I can't remember. I think it might have been Secretary French who said that the Supreme Court seems to have been moving the goalpost in this area, increasingly in the direction of saying anytime you discriminate with respect to the provision of government benefits, even with respect to the use of those benefits against religious uses or on the basis of religious status, that's going to violate the free exercise clause of the Constitution. So the goalpost is moving. But your question, Senator Campion, raised another point that I would like to make with the committee. That is, if you read the best practices recommendation of the Agency of Education, they don't just focus entirely on, religious purposes or not religious. They also say that to be approved, you need to comply fully with Vermont's anti-discrimination laws, for example. I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, good point.
I mean, I think two things are important. One, that we have a uniform state policy. What I've suggested is, hey, look, let's just let those districts that are under the gun make a policy statement. But we need a uniform policy, and the uniform policy ought to include generally the requirements for being an approved independent school. And that includes full compliance, for example, with the state's anti-discrimination laws. And at least at this point, unless you want to violate the compelled support clause in the Vermont Constitution, a certification requirement that you're not going to use those funds for purposes of religious instruction or worship. So yeah.
Other questions? Senator Hooker.
Thank you. Professor Teachout, I want to go back to the concept of, the curriculum, say, at a school that is permeated by the beliefs of a certain religion. Would that disqualify a school from getting tuition if their mission statement stated that their instruction and their existence was steeped in a particular religion?
Well, I'm going to give you a double answer to that, Senator Hooker. In the Chittenden School District case, Justice Dooley, writing for the majority, said, hey, look, we've never completely prohibited government aid to religious independent schools. We have approved providing them with books. We have approved providing them with transportation, public transportation. So the part of the answer is that school districts could still, without any trouble at all, still be entitled to receive that kind of government support if it took those forms. But I think a school that had a pervasively religious mission with religion pervading every aspect of the instructional program simply could not certify that the tuition money was not going to be used for purposes of religious instruction and worship. They simply couldn't do the certification. Now, I'm representing the plaintiffs in this case. I'd challenge that. That violates the free exercise clause, but it doesn't violate the free exercise clause at this point. So we're trying to buy a little bit of time until we can figure. I want to make one, excuse me, I'm for interrupting myself. I want to make one other point. If the court were to find that even prohibiting government aid for purposes of providing religious instruction and worship violated the free exercise clause, that would trigger something called a strict scrutiny standard of review. Vermont Constitution has in this compelled support clause a constitutional right that is probably as important as the right of free exercise. In some ways, it's just another way of saying that it's the right of conscience, the right not to be required to support the propagation of religious views with which you fundamentally disagree. If you read that historical appendix in my testimony, you will see that the Council of Censors, way back in the early 1800s, very much concerned with the problem of requiring people to support with their tax dollars the propagation of religious views with which they fundamentally disagree. That's why we haven't had taxpayer support of public school education since that time.
Do you have a follow-up, Senator? Mr. Desmarais.
Yeah, I want to go back to the conversation about making these religious schools subject to all anti-discrimination laws. So my understanding is that these schools are places of public accommodation, and therefore they would be subject to the anti-discrimination laws that apply to any place of public accommodation, whether it be a school, a restaurant, any place of a public accommodation. However, there are constitutional exceptions for religious organizations in employment laws. So there's a ministerial exception which says that for certain positions defined to be under the ministerial exception, which is a very vague concept, if you're employed by the school, you don't have the same rights as an employee to sue the school for discrimination. So I think the conversation around making the school subject to all laws around discrimination couldn't be done in that category because there's a constitutional issue you're running up against there that protects the schools in that way.
So Jim, you're absolutely right. For example, a school whose religious views were opposed to same-sex marriage can fire a teacher if they find out the teacher, in fact, has got a same-sex marriage because it conflicts, at least if it's a teacher who is responsible in part for teaching some course that involves perpetuation of the faith, whatever you put. They can fire them, not covered by anti-discrimination law. But you tell the independent school, you want to be free from application of the state's anti-discrimination laws, you're perfectly free to do that. But the consequence is you're no longer going to be an approved school for purposes of our tuition reimbursement program. What about that?
I just wonder whether that would be a different form of discrimination based on status.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah. Anyway, that would be one approach, at least in the short term, likely to be challenged. But you would simply say you can choose if you don't want to comply with our state's anti-discrimination laws, then you no longer are eligible for applying for tuition reimbursement as one of the state's approved schools. I don't know why the approval system, in fact, doesn't build that in, but the reason might be because that would be contrary to the ministerial exception. Well, jurisprudence. So we're trying to do the best. You can figure out how else to do it. I have suggested one way to respond, at least in the short term. There are no guarantees, first of all, that it won't be challenged, and two, that the court won't eventually strike down that approach. But at least at the present time, it would be perfectly consistent with both Supreme Court jurisprudence and Vermont state constitutional jurisprudence.
So has the case been appealed? I'm sorry for not knowing this. Has the case been appealed?
Which the French case?
The French case.
Yeah, there was a decision by Judge Rice, Federal District Court Judge Rice on January 7th.
Right, no, I understand, but has it
It
been?
wasn't appeal, it was appealed on an emergency basis. And one circuit court judge
Yeah,
issued an emergency injunction.
right.
My understanding was either this week or next week, there might be a panel of circuit judges that would look at the same question. But even then, the injunction simply says you've got to stop discriminating on the basis of religious status. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything it doesn't say you can't stop limiting the use of funds if those funds are going to be used for religious instruction purposes. Okay.
Other questions? So, please, if people didn't realize, you are now qualified to get 1 credit in constitutional law. Forward the document to me and I'll sign it. Professor Teachout, thank you very much. Very helpful as usual.
Thank you for the opportunity. I feel that we kind of rushed a little bit and there's a lot that needs to be thought over, but I appreciate the opportunity. And if I can be of any help in the future, just let me know, okay?
Absolutely. It was terrific and again, very helpful. And we're glad and grateful that you're on the other line to help us navigate these kinds of issues. So, and Professor, how are you related to Sarah Teachout?
Second cousin once removed.
Okay.
We're all related.
Sure.
Before I leave, Senator Chittenden and I were getting into a tete-a-tete over who had more ancient roots in Vermont. So, hey, Breast Orton, when Champlain came down from Canada to discover the lake that bears his name, he found a white man and 2 St. Francis Indians on one of the islands. And that white man's name, this is white privilege, I get that. We were summer people, but that white man's name was Teachout. Long before Tom Chittenden was even a spark in anybody's eye.
You win. You win.
Gotta keep that new guy modest. Absolutely. Thank you. We may have you back in again just to talk about your ancestors of Chittenden.
I'm sorry for taking up the committee's time. Thank you.
Nope. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon. And thank you, Jim. Did you have any other final comments? It sounds to me that that this committee, and I'll talk to Senator Sears to see how he wants to handle this, may need to take some kind of action.
Yeah, so it seems to me if there's action to be taken, there seems to be 2 paths in my view. One is by you as a General Assembly, and one could be alternatively by the Agency of Education directing school districts to do what Professor Teachout says, which is to have them respond in this way. Because it's really, you don't have to take action because it's really the school district that needs to respond and make it clear that they will pay tuition if they get the certification. You could direct that, or the agency could direct that. So I think there are 2 paths.
So we could direct the agency, or the agency could just take it up on their own.
Yeah.
Or we would need to act.
You could act directly and say, you could direct the agency, you could direct school districts directly. You could do either, or you could just ask the agency to direct school districts.
Committee thoughts, and Jim, before we sort of discuss this for just a few minutes, is there a way? I mean, basically, we're getting at this. We're reaching the same goal. This committee having the agency direct it would allow them and their expertise to work on it, and then, I mean, basically through rulemaking. Correct?
Yeah, it depends how far you go, because if you do the certification alone, I think you could just direct the agency you could actually direct the school districts. You have to go to the agency, just direct the school districts to require the certification.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to do that in combination with saying that the schools have to comply with all discrimination laws, then I think you have to take action to direct the in statute for the agency to update its approval regs for independent schools to include that as a requirement. So they have regulations already around approved independent schools. I haven't reviewed them for this, but I think they might have to add a condition that the school agrees to be approved that will comply with all anti-discrimination laws.
All anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah. So it depends which way you want to go. On that point, though, on if you want to go there, it will be challenged for sure. I think in court. If you want to take the safest approach in terms of something that will be more robust in court, I think you just do the certification and just leave it there. If you want to go further and require them to comply with the anti-discrimination laws, that's going to raise a separate constitutional issue that is challengeable. So it's a choice to be made there.
And those, if we were to move forward with the anti-discrimination law piece, would that be done by the state board?
That would be done, either you could direct the state board or you could do it directly yourselves.
Right, okay. Okay. Anybody have thoughts or preferences at this point? I think there might be, we may need to take a little more testimony. Senator Perchlik?
I guess my first question would be what the agency is thinking of doing, because if they are going to do it, then we don't need to do it. And if we're happy with the direction, if they say, yeah, this is the way we're gonna require this certification of all the schools, then that's kind of a done deal. I like the idea of requiring all schools follow the non-discrimination laws.
We'll certainly have the agency back in to get a sense of what they're going to do. Others looking at both these paths, are people wanting to do the certification only or both? Senator Lyons, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
So my question is a step back to, it's for Jim. Do you think that not having legislative action and legislative intent, or a new request of AOE legislatively or perhaps through resolution or letter, do you think does that in any way build a stronger case going forward, or just having that's the question, I guess, for me.
I'm not sure if I can answer that question. It's a very good question. I'm looking at the record before the courts who issued judgment so far. And the factual record they've seen is that school districts and the AOE has been saying, we can't give you public tuition because you are a religious school. So despite the use thing, the statements may have been about status. And that's what's killed them in court. So is it stronger to coming from the agency or from the state? I think as long as there's evidence on record that it's based on use, not status, that's a really good thing. Whether it's more powerful coming from the state or the agency, I'm not sure. I imagine the state's got a bit more power behind it, so maybe that would be a better way of approaching it, but I can't guarantee that. I'm not sure.
Senator Hooker, any thoughts?
I
feel free to say no, because
I know. Well, I did have a thought about when Jim, you said that if we did more than the certification, it would open us up to more lawsuits, more vulnerability. Can you just explain that? I guess. I mean,
Sure.
I'm looking first at Senator Perchlik's thoughts that he'd like to have the anti-discrimination language in there. And then I was thinking of Professor Teachout's thoughts about putting some kind of teeth into this certification with some kind of consequence if you are found to be non-compliant.
Yeah. So let's go through the two constitutional claims that could be made. Okay. The first constitutional claim is if you just do certification, and certification, of course, is based on use, not status. That could be challenged because the Supreme Court left it open as to whether they're going to honor that distinction going forward. So it's not clear to me that if you do this, it'll survive a court challenge eventually at the Supreme Court level, because the court might just say, we don't care if it's use-based or status-based, it's still discrimination and you can't do it. That's not where the court is today. So it's a bit of a projection, but that's the type of challenge you might see on certification. But if you do the certification thing, it gives you at least a better position to be in to argue with in that case, because today on the record it's based on stats, and that's what the courts are finding to be inappropriate. So if you do certification, there is a constitutional argument still, because the Supreme Court seems a bit unsettled on that point. When you require compliance with all anti-discrimination laws, including labor laws, you're opening a separate constitutional inquiry. And that is, there is by the Supreme Court decisions that say that certain members of staff at religious schools who basically teach education or have a ministerial function, the unemployment laws, the protections don't apply to them. So the example given by Professor Teachout is if you are gay or transgender, they find that out at your school. If you're in a ministerial position, you can be fired for that. So you don't have the usual protections that you have outside that religious school. So if you were employed by a private school, secular school, and you were fired for that, you have a claim. At the religious school, you wouldn't have a claim because there's this exception, and that exception comes from the U.S. Constitution. So once you go there, in terms of putting that anti-discrimination piece in, that will open you up to challenge that requirement to comply with anti-discrimination laws basically is a form of discrimination against that religious school based on status again. So I think that's why you've got a separate claim there that would be in addition to any claim you have on the main certification. I hope that's helpful.
Senator Perchel.
And the way I see it, I understand what Jim is saying, but since this would be a requirement to become an approved independent school, there might be some religious schools that don't follow the anti-discrimination laws, but it wouldn't be all of them. So it wouldn't be a constitutional, in my view, which is very uneducated on the topic, but because we're not saying because you're a religious school, you aren't becoming an approved school, it's because you didn't follow this requirement of following the state laws. And if I understand, like one school could say, well, we can't follow them because of our religious beliefs, and therefore it's a religious discrimination. But since it seems, from what I heard Professor Teachout say, it's debatable. So I would rather fall on the side of protecting Vermonters from that discrimination and then see where the constitutional chips fall later.
Senator Chinden.
I agree in concept with what you just said, Senator Perchlik, but I feel like what Jim is saying to us in practicality, in practical senses, if we add the anti-discrimination clause, we're inviting I'm going to just make a mock idea of a really bad school with terrible foundational and tons of issues, that they could then make the claim that they're not getting the funding because of this one little thing, and it's not the 50 other reasons why they can't qualify or be certified. Whereas if we just make it a certification thing, in practice and practicality, it's going to work out and achieve our ends. And what I think I heard Professor Teachout say is sometimes things are best addressed when they need to be, rather than through advanced perspective. So I hear you, and I agree we need to be anti-racist and anti-discriminatory, but it seems like in this sense, when writing this law, it might make more sense to just have a certification yet to be finalized or clarified.
But that doesn't, are you saying, Senator Chittenden, that you believe the same goals would be met?
In practice.
How so?
By having certifications that require certain accessibility, certain degree of parking, certain certifications of the faculty that teach there. I'm expecting that I would trust most on our civility in our society to have those certifications adopted by the Department of Education that are going to have any of those extreme schools already not meet that certification threshold without this anti-discriminatory clause. But I'm the new guy, so I could go either way on this.
No, I'm just, no, this is helpful. It's a conversation. So Jim, would that, the way Senator Chittenden is proposing, is there a way to protect LGBTQ students?
We're not talking about students protection here. We're talking about employee protections, okay?
I'm sorry?
We're talking about employee protections, okay, not student
Are we
protections.
able to protect the LGBTQ employees as Senator Chittenden puts forward through certification, or does it need to be?
I think it's kind of the same thing. I think
Okay.
if you require it directly through a law or through a certification or through rules, the substance of it is if you're requiring the business schools to obey federal and state employment laws, okay, then there's an exception that they can't take advantage of, which is in the Constitution. So that raises to me the question, are you then discriminating on those schools based on their status again? So I think that's the issue. I hear the arguments made by Senator Perslick, and I agree it's not a slam dunk case on either side. I'm just saying it's an additional substantive claim that I think you can expect to see brought in a case.
And may I ask, why is it not relevant? I mean, anti-discrimination policies, why are we not talking about students? For example, could a transgender student be turned down from a religious institution? Could Rice say we're not going to admit a transgender student?
I don't think so, because Rice, Vermont High School, and Burton are both places of public accommodation, and therefore, I believe they are subject to all of the requirements as a public accommodation, which bars discrimination based on all those categories of people that you're serving. So I don't think this is an issue around students. I think it's an issue around employment law of staff.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not the expert in this area, I'll have to say. I have researched it some, but you might want further testimony about, I mean, we have people in the ACLU and we got people in the anti-discrimination world who can have testify about how these laws work more, if you want.
No, it's a great conversation, very helpful. I appreciate everybody's questions and comments. Any other questions or comments at this point? It sounds like we should table it for now, let people think about it.
Senator Terenzini has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Terenzini. I apologize.
That's all right. Thank you, Senator Campion. To go along with Senator Campion's last question for Jim, and maybe you answered it already, but I'm thinking like Rice, MSJ, Burton, but then some of these, I don't know how you would define it, but a real like area Christian school that you are sent, you need a letter from your church, for example, as a student to get enrolled there and so on. Would a school like that have the ability to say yes or no based on sexual orientation or whatever else?
Again, if it's a place of public accommodation, I'm not sure the facts you gave me, I'm not sure how they fit that exactly, because you mentioned a letter in a church, but if it's a place of public accommodation, I believe it has to comply with all those laws around not discriminating against marginalized groups, people of color, people who are based on gender, or all that stuff. So I think the answer to your question is those rules would apply, but I would love to have that confirmed by somebody who knows more about this than me.
Thank you, Jim.
Senator Perchik, I just saw you unmuted. Did you have a question?
I was just going to say that to Senator Terenzini's question is, if the school is accepting public money, then I think what Jim was saying would apply. But like in my district, I have several Christian schools that are just private Christian schools that don't take public money. So they can do whatever they want because they're a private school. So
Right.
it wouldn't apply to them, I would assume.
I'm not sure about that. In terms of not admitting a student based upon the fact that that student is gay, I'm not sure they can do that.
But
Senator Perchik,
yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, Senator Terenzini.
no, I was going to say thank you, Senator Perchik. You cleaned up my question beautifully. That was way smoother than how I just said it. So thank you for that.
Senator Lyon.
Can I, so just going along with the comment that Jim made, the Equal Protection Clause under the Constitution might have something to say about the discrimination that would be seen in a purely religious environment, the schools that we've been talking about now. And that's a question, really, I guess.
I'm not sure I can answer that question. The Equal Protection Clause applies to government and to private businesses that are places of public accommodation, right? So again, it goes back to that same question I've been talking about. And maybe we get somebody from the Human Rights Commission or somebody in here to talk about how those laws apply.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? All right, so let's take 15 minutes. We'll return at 3:30, and Jim will still be with us to take us through the a proposal with regard to literacy, and have a good break. All right, welcome back. Jim, are you there?
I am here. I'm just trying to get myself there. I wanted to just, if I could, Sarah Campion, just for a second.
Sure.
I did pull up the Anti-Discrimination Law. I just wanted to read a brief thing, if I could, for you. It defines a place of public accommodation as any school, restaurant, store, establishment, or other facility at which services, facilities, goods, privileges, advantages, benefits, or accommodations are offered to the general public. So include schools. I think the question, though, that the Human Rights Commission hopefully could answer for us is whether a private school is open to the general public. If you think of the controversies around golf courses, private golf courses, which didn't admit Jews or blacks, and basically they said there was a members only club, right? So that's, I think, the conversation that would be useful to have. And if this does not apply to religious schools because they're private, then you might be able to apply this requirement to independent schools because that's not violating the Constitution, I don't think, in the same way it would for employment laws. So you could go further. But first question is, does this apply or not to a private school? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay. Committee, we have taken some testimony, as you may recall, looking at issues of literacy and where we are at with literacy in the state. And I asked the Agency of Education to basically give some thought to what we should be doing. What are some of the things that we could do that would actually help make a difference to improve outcomes in our state? And I think we all are well aware that it's a big question. It has a lot to do with, as we've talked about, 0 through 5, getting children ready for kindergarten, pre-K, nutrition, family life, very complicated. But Secretary French did come back with, I thought, some good recommendations, something that could be a starting point for us to have a conversation with as it relates to literacy. So I asked Jim to take Secretary French's ideas and draft them up. Just as a starting point, I did talk with the Pro Tem, as I mentioned, when we were getting things started. She would like us to do something or agrees with our direction to work on literacy rates in this state. So with that, Jim, if you don't mind sharing with us what you have come up with.
Sure. Jenny, do you want to let me co-host? See if I can share the screen.
You are co-host.
I am co-host. Great. Let's see what I got here. Here. Okay. I have it in front of me. Can you see this?
I don't.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to bring it over to the screen. Oh, sorry, I didn't hit. Sorry, I know what happened. To share. Oh, that's strange. Okay, try one more time. Screen share. And I'm going to. Huh. Okay, make sure that. Can you see that?
Yes, is it possible to make it larger?
I'll see.
Maybe I should stop probably asking that. Part of it is my eyesight, and I have just continue to avoid taking the step of getting a prescription filled for eyeglasses. So,
They're bigger?
I can see some black and white. So you go ahead.
It's 200% on my screen. Can you see this?
There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so
Okay.
much.
So for the record, Superintendent, this console, we're going through this what's called 21-807. This is draft committee bill.
We're losing you a little bit. It's technology.
What it does is it adds some.
Jim, can you hear me?
Okay.
We're having a little
I
difficulty.
can hear you. Yeah.
Only because of technology.
Hearing me?
Now we can.
Oh, okay.
Great. Do you want to start again?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let me move this over here. Okay. Okay, so let me minimize that. Okay, so this bill basically adds some duties of the supervisory union board around literacy. It begins with some findings. I won't read through the findings in detail, but findings center around Act 173 in the DMG report and its findings about best practices to support students who struggle. And it just outlines some of the findings in that report. And then the second theme in the findings is data. And it says that the data shows that from 2016 to 2018, only about 50% of students in grade 3 were proficient in English language arts. And And then it says from 2015 to 19, Vermont's average scale in grade 4 reading on the National Assessment of Educational Progress drops every year from a high of 230 to a low score of 222. And then the third theme here in the findings is around COVID-19, talking about the adverse effect and the fact that failure to address literacy outcomes now could significantly impact student development for many years to come. That's the framing of it through the findings. The bill language is quite short. It's amending a statute, which is 261A, which outlines the duties of supervisory union boards, and it's adding an additional duty, number 18, and that duty is to have a literacy policy that requires the implementation of a benchmark literacy assessment for all students in pre-K through grade 3, with scores that can be reported as Flexile scores. I'm not sure what that is, but the agency will, to the agency. And B, a process for identifying struggling readers, including students with dyslexia, and a description of the intervention processes dedicated to addressing the needs of these students. And the policy has to also, the board has to formally review and publish an annual monitoring report on student literacy outcomes. So that's what the policy would do. So 3 things in this policy. And then 19 is a new duty of the board to conduct an annual evaluation of the superintendent job performance, including whether the goals for improving student literacy outcomes have been met. And then the next section is around teacher preparation programs. It's a piece of session law, and it says on or before December 15th of this year, the AOE shall review teacher prep programs and report to you on to what extent these programs prepare teacher candidates to use science-based literacy materials and programs. And the effective date is on passage.
Thank you. So this is an opportunity to get some discussion going. We are going to take testimony on it tomorrow. We'll hear from what I refer to as our usual suspects, people representing teachers, superintendents, principals, school board members, and the Agency of Education will also be in later this week to weigh in. But I mean, in the short of it, it's, I don't know if anybody has any specific questions for Jim before actually I jump in and weigh in a little bit. Senator Perslick, please.
I had a question on the evaluation of the superintendent. So that's being done by the union board, and it's like on the performance weather goals for improving literacy. Was setting goals one of the requirements? Like, what goals are they evaluating against?
Well, I imagine what this is constructed to do is to require that the superintendent have goals around literacy outcomes at the beginning of a year, and then they get evaluated as to whether those goals are met at the end of the year.
Do you think that we need to say that in the policy that they have to set those goals, or is that's already somewhere else that they're setting those goals?
If that's somewhere else, I think you could be more expressed on that if you want to here. You could say you have to set goals and then evaluate. Yeah.
I think that would be good.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, you know, I think from some of the testimony that we heard, you know, is there a way to, you know, put this, you know, give greater direction to some of our local superintendents that, you know, are overseeing schools, work with them to make policies using the research out there that we can then, you know, start to measure through the testing method that, again, Secretary French and the administration put in there. And then also just generally look at how we are educating our teachers. So it really is kind of a broad overview or broad attempt at but I'd say also an important one to again, look at what our teacher education programs are doing, look at what our schools are doing, and work through our superintendents to take on these kinds of issues. Anything else? Senator Hooker.
Again, kind of a basic question. So what happens if the report comes back and the goals haven't been met? What happens? Does that fall on the back of the superintendent? Is the superintendent then relieved of his duties or
Jim,
hers?
Go ahead. If you want to, I have my thoughts and probably have yours. I think these are just general guidelines. During an evaluation process, I'm sure superintendents, principals, everyone, elected officials sometimes meet their goals, sometimes don't meet their goals. I don't think we're giving a weight to, and we'll wait to hear from Secretary French in more detail, but we're not really giving a weight to whether or not this would be so grave as an issue as it would require a termination.
Okay. I didn't see any kind of follow-up to, the report comes back on the evaluation of the superintendent. And then what?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and one that we can pull apart with Secretary French.
And that was my comment as well. And all the first three seem to be really important things to do, but then to evaluate an individual job performance for that, I don't know. It would be the same for any disciplinary area, academic disciplinary area. So it will be interesting to see what the secretary says.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, good question. Senator Persler.
I don't know if you want to take time on this, but one of the things that I remember I had questions on as a first year senator that our other senators might have is, which we haven't gone over yet, is when Jim mentioned about session law for that last section, or not the last section, but section 3. And then also findings, like what's the difference of things like findings and session law, and how important are they versus the stuff going in the statute?
I think it's great to take a minute and talk about session law and findings. Jim, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So session law and statutory law are both law. So they have equal force. The idea behind session law is it does not go into the green books you see on bookshelves. And so it's not codified, if you will. And the reason for that is that session law usually has a brief term to it. So for example, this section here around teacher prep programs, it says on or before December 15 of this year. So it's a very short-term thing. So it only exists for this year basically, and it's going to go away. It'll be done. So there's no reason to bulk up our green books with a bunch of stuff that's not going to be around for a long time. The last section, section 4, effective date, that's session law too. That is basically just saying take effective passage. It's codified is the more substantive things that will carry on for a longer period, basically. So that's the distinction you have between session law and statutory law.
And are the findings in the session law? They're just, where do the findings go?
Findings can go either way. You can put findings into statute, or you can put findings into session law. So it could go in either place. Findings in statute will be there. You'll find them in the books. Findings in session law, if you look at the act number and look at the act, you'll find the findings because it's part of the act. But you won't find them in the green books. So again, it depends on how how important they are, or how you judge them in terms of how much you want them to be visible to people.
Great. Questions? Okay. All right. So we have something from which we can work. It'll be a committee bill. We'll hear from more people tomorrow, as well as from, I think, the Secretary of Education. And we can continue to kind of plug away and hopefully come out with a literacy bill sometime next week. Additionally, I shared with Senator Ballant our work so far on S16, and so I thought we could take it. It's going to probably take more than just a minute, but I think it's worth now going through and starting to do a bit of a markup to get a sense of where committee members are on different issues, get some feedback. While we have Jim here, have him walk us through it again a little bit with pauses to see what people might have either support for, or if there's something that people are ready to start to remove. And so with that, everyone is ready to roll up their sleeves and jump into S16. And this, as a reminder, is the school discipline bill. So Jim, this is my, Senator Terenzini, please.
Just a procedural question, Mr. Chair. A bill like this, if we were prepared to take a vote on as a committee, I haven't had a vote in either of my committees yet. And just wondering, is it something we put on the calendar and there's notice of it? Or if we all decided later in the day, heck, we like how things are, you could call the question and we would vote? Or is there a procedure to it?
It's a great question. So my preference is to put it on the calendar. So for example, what I see us hopefully, and this is where it can be tricky, and I think we're all going to try to figure out how we all best will do this together. Some committees do it, differently, but trying to start to build some kind of consensus. And then let's say we worked on it, and then Jim brought us back another draft, let's say on Tuesday. Tuesday, we feel like, okay, we've really got something. I might put it on the calendar for Friday, which I think what I like about that, or at least giving people 24 hours, is it gives anybody who's sitting at home watching, advocates, others, to say, okay, wait, there was just that one more thing I wanted to say, or I noticed that they're moving in this direction. It gives them another chance to weigh in.
Thank you. And
then at that moment, when we do get to that point, sometime, one of the things that I didn't know until I think a couple years into the work is our rules mirror what happens on the Senate floor. So that the committee is really the same. So we can either do a voice vote or we can do a roll call. But the rules mirror one another. So, when it gets to the point, our clerk, Senator Perchlik, he may call the roll, or we just may be so clearly so much in consensus that, we all just say, okay, time to move on, and we all support it. Okay. Recognizing also that this, again, is our sort of first stab at kind of walking through things and seeing how it all work. What I'll plan on doing is, based on people's comments, working with Jim to come up again, with another draft, so that we'll have more time. One of the things, though, Senator Terenzini, periodically there might be something that we get to a point where, hey, is this with certain bills? It may not be this one, but I know in natural resources and energy with long bills, sometimes it's, you have to have committee votes on different parts going in. I suspect that could be true with other long bills and transportation, et cetera, and then you try to get to some consensus, and hopefully the majority of the folks agree, and even the people that might not have supported one part still believe in voting and supporting the overall bill. And of course, to get something out of this committee, we need 4 people. If I'd gotten my wish, there would only be 5 people on this committee. But it's I'm up for the challenge. So with that, Jim, do you mind starting to take us through a little bit and just maybe high level and just see where people say, hey, you know, this is just not feeling great to me. Or, you know, we'll just keep going and Jim, I'm not sure if you're speaking. We don't hear you if you are.
He's muted. Jim's muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Great.
Great.
Can you see this document?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Okay, it begins with, let me size it. Too big over the screen. Do that instead. Okay. So it is obviously a bill that creates the School Discipline Advisory Council. It has a number of findings. I wouldn't propose to go through them in detail.
Right.
Unless
Nope,
Chair
that's
wants
fine.
me to.
If people want to review or if anybody sees anything of immediate concern with regard to the findings, but I think we'll pass on the findings unless somebody, knowing that we'll also have additional time on this. So,
Okay.
want to pick up on section 2?
Okay, yep. Findings are quite long. Okay, section 2 is adding a new section of law, 1164.
Jim?
Sorry,
to create.
Well, if you're going to do the screen share, you're not moving the document, at least the way I see it. Like you might be looking at a different document. I'm looking at my own document, but if somebody's looking on the screen, it's not scrolling.
Oh, I'm not
You know
sure
what I
why.
mean?
I'm sorry. Let me stop screen sharing.
Okay.
Unless anybody wants that.
I don't. Everybody have it right there? Great. I think we're okay, Jim.
Okay. Okay, so section 2 of the document creates, and this is statute because usually working groups, task forces are session law because they only last for a year or so, 2 years. This is a permanent council. So it's not designed to be temporary. So you're creating the School Discipline Advisory Council, which will, in consultation with the Commissioners of Corrections and Public Safety, collect and analyze data regarding school discipline in Vermont public and approved independent schools in order to inform strategic planning guide statewide and local decision-making and resource allocation and measure the effectiveness of statewide and local policies and practices. We'll get more into the duties of this council as we go. The members are 15 members. You got the Secretary of Education, the Commissioner for Children and Families, the Defendant General. Page 5, you got the State's Attorney's Office, State's Attorney's Insurance Association. You've got the Superintendent selected by the Vermont Superintendents Association. 2 principals, 2 teachers, and 2 special education teachers selected by the Principals Association, the Vermont NEA, and the Vermont Council of Special Education Administrators. And you got the Executive Director of the Vermont Human Rights Commission, the Executive Director of the Vermont Legal Aid, 2 parents of students who have received out-of-school suspensions, selected by the Secretary. Let me pause there.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
See whether people have comments on the composition of the members.
And just so senators know, and hopefully Senator Pershlick, who's on this committee for the past 2 years, and Senator Lyons, who's worked on a lot of these kinds of bills, and Senator Hooker also helped me here. I just want to make sure Senator Terenzini and Senator Chittenden understand everything as we follow, as we're moving along. But sometimes these are a little bit pro forma. Sometimes some people will just kind of put in, these would be the standard people that you might consider. I don't know if Senators Rahm or Sears came and had a specific reason, for example, the Defender General. And if people, as we're going through this, want to have a greater explanation, we can certainly have that particular witness in, or we can reach out to the two senators. But just know sometimes with some of these committees, it's, all right, the speaker's going to appoint somebody, the pro temp's going to appoint somebody, AOE, et cetera. Senator Terenzini.
Yeah, thank you. And I do what you said. I printed off the bill and I marked it all up. I don't know if you see my highlighter marks, but the one concern that I had.
Do me a favor and go get your wife or one of your children just to. I can't see it actually, so just
I'll take a picture and send it to you later. All right. The one section on who would be on the board that's concerning to me from a stance of, I think these folks, this is an important job. And I think these folks need to be subjective, non-biased in either direction, and just look at the facts and the data. I don't see value in having two parents of Vermont students who have received out-of-school suspensions serving on this committee, quite frankly, because I think that in many cases, they could be jaded that their children did get suspended. And I just don't see the value in what they're going to bring to the table. So that was one thing that I circled and highlighted that I could really be in favor of seeing removed. I can understand a lot of the players listed, but that to me just didn't seem like a fair, non-biased approach with these two parents of suspended students.
Senator Chittenden.
Connecting with what Senator Terenzini just said and what I've heard you say, Chair Campion, I'm going back to Secretary French's 3-page testimony that he put in writing regarding this. And he has some pretty good things that seem to make a lot of sense to me. And the fourth item really charges or suggests to us that we instead establish a task force and have the Agency of Education, with their expertise and knowing who needs to be at the table, appoint to this commission. Is that where you were leading with your opening, Chair Campion, that maybe we don't need these specific people in the statute, and instead we could trust more of the Agency of Education with a clear charge as to what we want to do, including the Secretary French's suggestion that they appoint the members of the body?
I think we could go one of two ways. We could, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, we could charge the Agency of Education in some ways to create a task force or work within what they already have within the Agency of Education, or we can move in this direction of having this separate council that will do this work.
Yeah, you have that choice. I think I'll mention too now, looking at this bill again, I'm not sure why this is designed to be a permanent council, because it's actually got a temporary task, which is only a couple years out. So I think wherever we do, we should change the session law and have it be a task force. And you can do it through the agency, or you can name the members yourself, but I think the construct of this should change to task force with a 2-year remit.
How does everybody feel about that? Senator Lyons.
That sounds like a good suggestion. And I was going to add another way of looking at membership, and we could also decide that there were certain areas of experience or expertise that would inform the work. And so then say, for example, someone with an understanding of discipline at the secondary level, I don't know what it would be, but each one of these people listed brings a certain amount of expertise to the discussion. And to Senator Terenzini's point, rather than say to parents of students who have received an out-of-school suspension. I guess I almost agree with that. But I do think it's good to have people who have experienced the system. And then there must be a better way of wording this, that we could identify someone who has worked within the disciplinary framework in schools, or, so I'm just thinking that that's another way of looking at this. Because I'll tell you, I'm very concerned about the front load of the Defender General and the State's Attorneys and Sheriffs Association. It's not a very positive statement, so sorry.
Before we go to Senator Perschlick, I'm just wondering, Jim, so a task force, if we are, so would we say in the bill that we're asking the Agency of Education to create this task force, and as Senator Lyons said, within that task force, we hope that the following in general, these are the kinds of people we hope they would consult?
Yeah, I'm suggesting framing it as a task force because it has a limited remit. It only has 2 years. It has a very specific function for a duration of 2 years.
Yeah.
So whether you decide to name the members yourself or have the agency name the members, that's a decision you can make in the context of having a task force.
Got it.
Yeah.
Senator Perschlick?
Yeah, I agree with what Senator Lyons was just saying about that subsection A, the creation, like, unless somebody else wants to argue or have the corrections of public safety come in and say if they want to be, I mean, this isn't consultation with them, but I just don't see why we're doing that. I would strike that. But I also just have a question about, creating a task force. I think in general, I worry that we create task force for things that the state government should be doing.
Yeah.
And we just rely on all these people and we give them whatever, $30 for going to a meeting. And I mean, I agreed with Senator Chittenden that I kind of liked the Secretary of Education's approach, saying, we're going to do this. We will have a task force that we'll appoint and we'll work on it with them because we do want to hear different voices because that just makes it better. But you're not setting up a whole legislative task force, because I think sometimes it's overused as a way just of getting out of doing the work that we should be doing.
And since the agency supports it and they want to do this work, I'm certainly comfortable with that. Senator Hooker?
And I think that, I'm waiting to hear from the agency what happened to the last tranche of data that they've collected, and, what's been done with the recommendations that were brought forth, whether it was from the 2015 study or the 2017 study. And I agree that, to form a task force sort of just for the sake of forming a task force is not something that I think is very productive. So if this work is being done, then I would like to know what's been done with the work and the findings of the past and what they would anticipate doing with findings that come from expanded work in the future from the department.
So for example, just for clarification, so we engage the agency again, say, all right, this is being done, the finding, what sorts of work are you doing? And then after this 2 years, or what exactly would you anticipate doing after that? I mean, based on whatever guidelines or research or data is collected, is that?
Yeah, I mein, they have a start.
Right.
And what's been happening with the stuff that they already have. The one thing that I would say that I'd like to see is a change in what the policies are on why kids are suspended. I mean, I think, as we were told before, if you change what the infractions are that lead to suspension and get rid of the things that are sort of the cigarettes, for instance.
Right.
You wouldn't be able to go deer hunting, but to get rid of those minor infractions that have led to suspensions, then that might be a real start for making progress in this situation.
Yeah. Senator.
Did you say my name? Yeah, and I like the way that Secretary French worded it too, because it's like make recommendations to end suspensions and expulsions. And what we talked about the other day is like we don't want to set up another task force to study this issue.
Right.
We need more data, but we also already have the recommendations. I don't know if other people looked at that U.S. Commission of Rights report that was mentioned in the testimony yesterday or the day before, but there was great series of recommendations, very clear based on the data that they found in Vermont. So I would like to see this task force have more direct tasks like that. Like, we know we should end the zero tolerance policy. So let's do that. We want to figure out how to end suspensions and expulsions. Let's figure out how to do that. Then, and in addition to getting the data thing right, which is another of the recommendations, but that's my overall. I'd like to see it more pointed to doing the recommendations that have already been made.
So sort of setting out a range of goals, basically, that they'll work on and implement over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, goals seems a little too wishy-washy. I guess I'd want to say, here are these recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We want from what I've read, I'm okay saying we want to make a recommendation on ending suspensions and expulsions, except for the most serious behaviors. How are we going to do that instead of like, should we end expulsions?
Right. Senator Chittenden.
So, Senator Perchlik, so are you looking at page 3 of Secretary French's testimony? Okay, because he spells things out, and what you were just describing is what I'm seeing there, and it seems the clarity that I'm looking for as to what we would charge them to do. I don't know if you've all seen that, but if you look at the witnesses, page 4, the task force seems to. I'm completely in line, and I agree with everything Senator Perchlik just said, and it's right there too.
I just think there's some additional ones that from recommendations from those other reports, the kicked out report and the human rights report, that we could add to that.
Great.
So
Senator Lyons, please.
Yeah, no, so it's more like identifying best practices and programs that will eliminate the need for expulsions and suspension. So that means that districts around the state would probably be engaged, because there are some where the data shows that they have a greater success as keeping kids in school.
Right.
So, so I agree with what you're saying.
Please.
And I just want to make sure that the thing that is ongoing about this is the collection of data at the agency.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So Jim, with regard to this being a 2-year task force, do we need to put language in there that we want this data collected, that this is going to be ongoing? We need to do anything like that?
Well, if it's a 2-year task force, then of course it's functional end in 2 years. So right now it's set up that the task force has to give a report to you guys, on before January 15th of next year. It's really a 1-year task force at this stage.
And we could put in there, though, that, even after the task force is dissolved, we want this data. We want to make sure that the agency continues to collect this data for legislative reports, et cetera.
Yeah, you could impose an obligation on the agency separately to continue to collect and provide this data. Yeah.
Senator Lyons?
Well, and I was also thinking that if you had the task force, the first year do what's here, the second year do sort of a mini evaluation of whether or not some of the recommendations have been implemented, and understanding that 1 year may not be sufficient to see good, outcomes that in the right direction, but to get a sense of what schools are doing for improvement. So there could be another use of the task force for that second year, instead of just dropping them after they've invested some time and energy into understanding and working on the issue, to keep them around for however long we want, or bring them back to look at whether there's been an effect.
And just while we're on the topic of the task force, I think that's great. Do senators want to give the agency the broad sort of, hey, create a task force. Here are some of the areas of expertise and the kinds of people that we hope you will consider? Keep it broad like that? Or do people want to be a little more prescriptive? Senator Perschlick?
I'm okay with the way Senator French had put it for now. We might hear from others. So with reserving my right to change my mind, I think the way that he laid it out in his bullet list of the type of people, making sure that there's racial diversity, is sufficient, instead of us always, trying to say two of these people, one of these people.
I agree.
You kind of have to trust them that they're going to appoint people that are going to be helpful.
Jim, are you getting all this? Is this all helpful in terms of guiding a second draft?
Yeah, I am getting it. I was just looking for the testimony of Dan French, which I hadn't seen before. So it sounds like you want to go in the direction of having the agency appointing task force. You want to give them some steer maybe on membership or types of people that might be on.
We were going to stick with the language that Secretary French has there.
Okay, I've got to find that, so I will find that. Yeah.
Great. Senator Piranzini, how is all this feeling to you?
Well, to start, so yeah, good conversation.
Okay. And as we're finding that, again, we'll see another draft, but this is helpful. Senator Perschlick.
I also liked French's name of the task force better too. Instead of School Discipline Advisory Council, he called it the Task Force on School Discipline Reform.
Mm-hmm. I'd certainly support that. Everybody okay with that? So Jim, I think that gets us to let's see. Page 6 of my copy, around powers and duties of the task force.
Right. So Dan French has a list in his testimony I'm seeing, which will be different than what you're seeing here. So do you want to go through what he recommends or what this recommends?
I don't have that page. Let me pull that up. Let's give everybody a minute. For some reason, I don't see that.
Campion, I dropped the link to the Secretary French's testimony in the chat, if that helps at all.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, I have the same thing, but I just, for some reason, don't have that page.
It's on the last page of his testimony.
Got it. So are we looking specifically now at starting on page, did you say the last page?
Yeah, page 3.
Number 4 on page 3. He has specific language proposed for in items 1, 2, and 3 that our conversation hasn't gone there yet, but I think it's worth discussing as well.
So so certainly section 4.
Yeah, it's really only section 4.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, again, I'm looking for the administration's partnership in this, and I think what they put forward certainly looks good to me. Others? Senator Hooker, what do you think?
You're still muted, Senator Hooker.
You're muted, Senator Hooker.
I don't know why you're still muted.
Oh, you're still muted.
No, I just had too many things open. Sorry.
Oh,
No problem.
No, I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm just trying to digest all of this.
And remember, even though we're, you know, again, lots of things go into this process, a lot of conversations. We're not going to take any votes. Jim is listening to our conversation, if you will, and adding and subtracting. Senator Terenzini.
Yeah, that was exactly my question, was everything that we talk about, then Jim takes, recreates the proposed bill, and then we look at the next edition, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
And if you have a talented chair like Health and Welfare, it probably would be done by the end of the afternoon, but with the new chair, it might take a little longer. Jim, were you going to say something? Or Senator?
No, I think what I'm hearing is I keep the findings, I change this into a task force, and I put in what the secretary wants here. So that'll be your next draft, which you can have tomorrow if you want.
Senator Perslick.
I mean, I think for now, I would like what the bill S16 has for the tasks, as well as the tasks that the secretary proposed. Because I think there's good ones in there too. I haven't had time to really digest all of them to see which ones we don't need. So I think for now, for the next draft, it would be good to have all of them in there, and then we can see.
And then we can sort of sort through them. Great. Jim, is that okay with you?
Yeah, I think they're going to overlap quite a bit. So I'll just put them in like brackets so you can go through them all. That's how you want to do.
I mean, if there's overlap, you can, I don't think, you can yank certain ones out, but when there isn't, it would be great for us to make those decisions. Okay, anything else?
Please. The other thing that is that I don't see in either the secretaries or these. This one talks about the data, but I don't think either of them really focus on getting the data, collecting better data and making sure it's collected, which is one of the recommendations from the reports. So that's another maybe placeholder that I'd like to see in the next draft, so we can say like, okay, what is the problem with the current data, and what do we need to ask be done differently on that?
It's a great point. And one of the things I remember, I think it was Mr. Diaz said yesterday, Bennington, for example, they weren't able to get data at one point from Mount Anthony High School. I remember there was also some issues with just data collection, and I think we've touched on this a little bit in the past in this state because of school size, confidentiality, those kinds of things. But we definitely should make sure that we have language in there that does allow us to this task force and the agency to collect the data and to do it regularly. Senator Lyons.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And to be allowed to aggregate the data, somehow if an individual school has a problem and data set is tiny.
Yeah.
Someone needs to be able to sort that out. So, and that would be the school that would have that responsibility. But if there's a escalation in, expulsions, you want to be able to identify that. So, but you're right. And so I don't know what the current criteria are for data collection in this area. So, I mean, we've done some work in Department of Health on racial equity and other, BIPOC, LGBTQ data collection, building a dashboard. And I don't know if we want an extensive collation of information over time. We're looking for that. It certainly could be useful, and I don't know what currently that looks like.
Senator Lyons, do you have difficulty collecting data in health and welfare? I mean, is data collection an issue? No,
it would, because we no, we don't.
Okay. Yeah, as Mr. Diaz and everyone says, without the data, I mean, how do you make good decisions? How do policymakers and members of the administration and others make timely and thoughtful and good decisions? Senator Chittenden.
So on this point, what I recall is Secretary French, and I think we've already addressed it by shifting from a standing council towards a task force. I think he just wanted to have the data collected within the current streams. I think he expressed some hesitancy of having a whole new council stand up another data collection method. And what I heard in his testimony, what I'm seeing in the document in the first page, is just like, we'll collect it. So I still support putting in this to charge the Secretary of Education to capture this. I would just want to empower them to add it as part of their standing processes with how they collect data from all of the schools out there. So I think it makes sense to include it, to keep it, but I think we've already fixed this by not having a standing council be charged with the data collection. Yeah, I mean, not having the standing council to collect it, and now that we're going to have a task force for 2 years, this needs to be on the agency, and the agency needs to be the ones that do it. I mean, one of the other things I should just thinking back, I don't remember if it was Amanda or someone else, that there was concern, and Secretary French didn't mention it, but people felt as though this needed, if we were going to move in any direction, that it did need financial support. And I guess, we'll have to have Secretary French in to, once we get closer to a final draft, and ask again, are there some financial needs here, or is this work that you feel you can handle? I mean, those of us who've been here for a while now do feel, I think, that this agency, and I could be wrong, has gotten smaller and smaller over the years, and I know that people are really pressed. They work really hard, but and we'll have to look to the Secretary to help guide us around whether or not there are any financial needs.
I have a question. We have in the Department of Health what's known as a youth risk behavior survey, and so data is collected about issues related to youth behaviors and when there are problems. So in an attempt to look at where we need to put efforts on prevention, and I honestly I can't remember whether or not information about suspensions is in there. But I'm wondering if there's a link to be made between AOE and DOH, Department of Health, Agency of Education, that youth risk behavior survey could inform the data collection or help with that data collection. I can't answer that question. That's a question for those two agencies, but so just a thought there, because there's a lot of information and data.
Yeah. I think it's a good point, and we can have them in Department of Health in also, if you'd like to help answer that. The other thing I want to put on the table for new senators is, as we make our way through this, one of the ways to think about it is not dissimilar again from the floor. Is you can bring in amendments, you can propose amendments just orally. As we get closer, you'll see sometimes that kind of thing will happen. It's usually done in a more informal way, but I know in natural resources and sometimes in finance, somebody will make a motion to make a change, or somebody might bring in language that they would like a specific committee vote on as it relates to a change that they would like to make. So keep that in mind. Senator Coker.
So that being said, Senator, if we do a strike all to this, and it's going to mean that we can make many changes without having to have amendments until the bill is formed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I just reminded myself, I went out and looked up the survey, and it is AOE and Department of Health that collect the information together. So it might be interesting to have a conversation with the secretary about whether or not it's useful to have that, just work with that. So there's high school reports, middle school reports. It's good.
Yep.
I should have known that.
Anything else for now for Jim to get started on what would be a second draft? I mean, there are a lot of moving parts here, and I think a second draft is going to certainly help focus us and get down to some of the deeper questions. And just for new members, this really isn't a bill. This is just practice. We just thought we'd take you through. There's really no S16. Just an opportunity to work through the process. Jim's not even laughing anymore. Jim's, get me out of there. Is there anything else, Jim, that you need from us? Or do you feel like for a second stab at this, you're okay?
I'm fine. Yep, I can get going on this. And
I'm not sure, Secretary French isn't available until until Friday. So perhaps, on Friday would be another good day to, have him in, and we might have some others respond to that.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So why don't we leave it there for the day? I think that's quite a bit. We can continue this, and we can look at VSAC things going forward. I feel like we're in pretty good shape in terms of moving things along on this and a few other bills. We'll dig more into literacy, VSAC. I asked Jim, we may do it tomorrow if he's available, take us through the questions or the proposal that VSAC put on the table, and we can weigh in and sort of build off of that based on some of the ideas from other people in this committee, as well as the other bills that are in. And again, from the Pro Tem's office, I think there's general interest in, giving relief to students out there. And I don't remember when I have them coming in, might not be until, I'm sorry, I don't remember, but the McClure Foundation is also going to be coming in and just talking about, again, how transformative their grant was, and some of the information that they've now gleaned from having done that, some of the experiences students have had, et cetera. Senator Perschler.
Do you picture that bill being another committee bill, or taking one of the kind of higher education bills we have on the wall as a vehicle, or doesn't matter at this point?
I could do it either way. Yeah, I could do it either way. Yeah. So. Okay, should we leave it there? Okay, thanks everybody. I thought that was a first time, very smooth, very fluid, very cooperative. Great. Thank you all. Have a good evening.